February 1944. The Baltic is a hard mirror. A trawler coughs through sleet, winch whining, until the net hauls up what the tide has rehearsed all night. A man in a Royal Navy coat, eyes in the half-closed compromise of the newly drowned, a black briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. The captain swears softly, makes the sign he hasn't made since childhood, and orders a tarp. By the time the harbormaster is telephoning the consulate, the documents are already gathering their audience. Clerks, officers, interpreters, all the way down a corridor that leads in the end to a map on a wall in Berlin. That is where the story lands. But it begins with smoke and doubt. The room is called a committee because that is a polite way of saying argument. Every chair is occupied by someone with a stake in deception, MI5 watchers whose business is people, Admiralty men whose business is ships, RAF men whose business is weather. The carpet is scuffed by shoe leather that has paced through too many raids. The walls are close with the smell of inked carbon copies and boiled tea and the faint, unslept scent of men who haven't been home for 3 days. A clock insists, with the piety of clocks, that everything is proceeding in orderly minutes. Charles Cholmondeley arrives with a paperback crime novel that has been to war with him in a coat pocket, spine white, corners turned down at chapters where the author cheats. He is thin in a way that makes people think he is cold. He is not cold, he is impatient. He sets the book on the green baize and pushes his glasses up his nose with the absent thumb of a man who has already rehearsed the speech a dozen times in his head and is now rehearsing all the ways it can go wrong. We need to put something in their hands that will make sense of their worst assumptions, he says, without preface. There is a scratch of chair legs, a sigh that is almost a laugh, someone setting down a pen as if preparing to watch a performance. "Go on, Cholmondeley," says a colonel with a mouth like a closing file. "A body," he says, "a dead officer, washed ashore with a briefcase. Letters between senior staff, careless in that believable way, pointing away from where we intend to strike. Something tidy, something inevitable. They read it, and Germany turns its head for us." Silence. Then, "You propose to scatter corpses like confetti, do you?" An RAF man with frost still behind his ears. "What are we now, undertakers to policy?" Ewan Montague does not laugh. He is a barrister, which means he has spent years being the only person in the room who believes something is both mad and necessary. He rests his hands on the table as if on a witness stand and asks the thing no one else will. Could it work? Cholmondeley's relief is a tiny thing, a breath snagged against teeth. If we make it right, if the papers smell correct, if the story the body tells is the story they are ready to hear. Montague's head turns fractionally, weighing something no scale measures. And if it does not work? If a Spanish coroner writes us a scandal? If a German pathologist smells rat and the neutral press learns we dress the dead? "Then I will take responsibility," Cholmondeley says, too quickly. He has been up nights with this sentence, and it has come out dressed in bravado. He catches himself, less theatrical. Then we will have failed with a dead man's dignity in our hands, which is a thing I will not do lightly. Montague looks down at his notes, finds that he has written nothing. This, too, is evidence. He thinks of Sicily's cliffs and the weight of the obvious. He thinks of the reports. Panzer groups massing, the infantry that never seems to arrive on time because trains are shells and rails are sighs, and the arithmetic that sends bombers across water and brings back fewer than it sent. He thinks of a letter he cannot unread from a mother who sent a son to the sea and received only a ribbon. He looks up. "Show me how it could work," he says. What follows is a slow robbery of impossibilities. First, A body, not requisitioned, one does not requisition grief, but found. The hospitals offer nothing but rules. The coroner's office offers nothing but complications. The law offers Montague a set of terms under which everything is respectable, and a second set under which nothing is. In the end, it is a doctor with a bleak sense of charity who telephones quietly about a man alone in the world who has died of something no one need write down twice. Glyndwr Michael, Welsh, unclaimed, a life with pieces missing. The poison in his stomach has softened him in ways that will, to a rushed eye, speak of water and not of hunger. The morgue is a room where time apologizes and cold takes up residence. Montague stands with his hands in his coat pockets because there is nothing useful they can touch. Cholmondeley is careful. He keeps his voice ordinary about weather and tea because the dead have a way of making men theatrical. They are introduced to the man they will ask to be a major. They make no promises. They agree instead to honor him with competence. The legend they build for him begins with an argument over his name and ends with the contents of his wallet. Major William Martin, Royal Marines, because it is a name that glances off the eye. His pockets acquire debts and receipts because men are collections of small failings as well as large loyalties. A photograph of a woman is found in a drawer of the props office. A secretary with a smile that looks like it could survive electricity shortages. They call her Pam because one of them once knew a Pam and she wrote fair letters. Montague writes one now, careful not to be a novelist. He does not reach for poetry. He reaches for the weather and for promises about nothing important, and the effect is a life. He reads it aloud because sound is a better forgery test than sight. "Dearest William," he says, and the way the word dearest sits in his mouth is almost too affectionate, so he scratches it and writes darling instead. "You forgot the tickets for the theatre. You always forget the tickets. Do try not to leave them this time. You know what you are like once you've had 2 gins." He lets the line stand. It is the sort of petty truth that lifts a lie over the bar of suspicion. The briefcase is chosen for the way it looks sturdy in photographs. The handcuffs are chosen for sound. Metal has a reassuring authority when it chimes against another metal in a quiet room. The papers inside are a committee's dream of loose tongues. A letter in a tone that is not cynical enough to be fake, but not official enough to be a communiqué. A second letter that mentions dates without fixing them. A third that thanks someone for their discretion, thereby guaranteeing its absence. The forger at his desk is a magician with a rubber stamp and a needle and thread. He shows Montague the trick of making a document look as if it has been badly folded by someone who was hurried and not by someone who is lying. He knows which ink looks like December and which looks like July. He knows the misprint on the Admiralty's letterhead that has never been corrected because war is always almost out of stationery. He knows what a colonel called a colonel in a letter to another colonel after midnight because tone is the first test and the last. They argue over whether to include a theatre stub. "Too pretty," says the forger. "Too perfect," says Montague. "Exactly human," says Cholmondeley, and slides it into the purse with the little agonized pleasure of a craftsman who knows when to lose an argument for art. There are objections that arrive not as thunder, but as drizzle. The Foreign Office wants the plan turned into Latin declensions and then buried. The Admiralty frets about the Spanish, whose neutrality is elastic, and whose officials are busy, and whose coroners are occasionally thorough. The RAF wonders if it would be simpler to drop leaflets. The Army wonders whether deception is becoming a substitute for training. Someone says, "We will be found out," and what he means is, "I would prefer to be in a war I understand." No one says that the war they understand has already ended and left this one behind. Montague gives assurances he can't believe out loud and can't afford to doubt in his head. He arranges conversations in corridors that go better than conversations at tables. He photographs the papers and then scratches the photographs because if the wrong man sees the right picture at the right time, the wrong man will die. He drafts a memorandum that neither commits nor refuses and is therefore permission. He phones a man at the coroner's office at an hour when tiredness makes clerks harmless. He signs his own name less often than is usual and more often than is safe. Cholmondeley rehearses the delivery the way an actor rehearses his second-best role. The submarine will surface off Huelva under a moon that doesn't read reports. A dinghy will carry a wrapped shape to a current that minds its business. The Spanish will find what they are primed to find. The Germans will read what they are primed to read. The entire plan rests on the most fragile of premises, that people are willing to believe that other people are careless. It is, Montague thinks, a study in pride. They test the legend in a dozen small ways. A naval officer who does not know he is examining a fiction snorts at the tone of a line in one letter. No one in our shop says, "at your earliest convenience," unless they intend rudeness, and so the line is softened. A wren with a soldier for a brother looks at Pam's photograph and says, "Not that girl, that one," and produces, from her purse, a snapshot in which the smile is less brave and therefore more likely. Pam acquires a different mouth. The paybook acquires a smudge on the page where a man would lick his thumb to count notes. There is a rehearsal with the handcuffs. They tighten the cuff on the dead man's wrist and discover, too late to tell a journalist, but just in time to save a plan, that metal shrinks cold and skin changes its mind about what it can hold. They adjust. They test the lock again and again until the sound of closing is both comfort and threat. They practice the etiquette of being found. The coat buttoned badly, the cap at an angle, the wallet where a careless man would keep it, the letters folded into that clumsy shape men make when they have done something too slowly. Montague goes home long enough to sit at his kitchen table and eat bread that tastes of nothing. He has the letter from Pam in his pocket and reads it to see if it is still his or if it has become public property. He thinks of Glinda Michael and the mathematics of consent. He thinks of the difference between dignity and utility, and the liar's comfort that sometimes they are the same. He tells himself, the thing that lets him sleep, that he is building a story that will reduce the number of names carved into stone. The Spanish problem remains the Spanish problem. Huelva is a nest. German agents attend Mass there with an enthusiasm entirely new to their priests. The police are underfunded and therefore attentive to envelopes. The coroner is reputed to be competent and therefore dangerous. The British consul is reputed to be reasonable and therefore useful. Montague writes a note for the consul that manages to suggest both concern for property and indifference to contents. An officer is missing. A briefcase attached to his person contains sensitive materials. We simply ask that it be returned unopened if found. It is exactly the sort of note a guilty bureaucracy writes when it suspects it is about to be embarrassed. The day before they are due to sail, a junior official finds an inconsistency in the dates on one of the letters. It is nothing a busy German won't forgive, but everything a careful German might notice. The forger stays late, refreshing ink that will need time to dry. A clerk bumps the blotter and leaves a kiss of ink where no one wants one. The forger considers shouting and instead goes for a cigarette and returns with a solution a schoolboy would have known. He folds the paper so the smudge becomes the hinge of an ordinary crease. The letter becomes older by a day. In the morning, the submarine smells the way iron does when it has learned too much. The captain takes the men below names and above rumor. The package is brought aboard in a canvas cradle that pretends this is cargo. Cholmondeley stands with his hands in his pockets and tells himself he is here to observe. He is here, in fact, because he believes that the things we ask others to do, we should be willing to smell. The sea takes the body with a sound like a man sitting down after a long day. The dinghy rocks. A searchlight moves on the horizon with the indifference of someone doing a different war. The chain glints as if it is proud of something. A sailor mutters a prayer in a language no one here speaks and everyone here understands. The captain nods once. The dinghy returns heavier by nothing. Back in London, the room exhales, but only a little. Now the plan is in other hands. Salt, currents, fishermen, police, clerks, attachés, interpreters, the great anonymous cast that makes a deception successful or a headline. Montague writes the first sentence of a report and leaves the rest blank because events have not yet offered him grammar. Cholmondeley goes to the pub and orders a gin and does not drink it. He folds the theatre stub in his pocket out of habit and opens it again because ritual is a kind of courage. When the telegram comes that a body has been found on a Spanish shore, the room does not cheer. It acknowledges. There is a moment of crowded quiet in which every man present privately withdraws the loudest of his earlier objections and replaces it with a hope he will not say aloud. The consul sends a cable that reads like a man moving furniture with his mind. The Spaniards are cooperative in that peculiar way neutrals are cooperative. Everything is done properly, unless someone asks whether it might be done improperly with greater dispatch. Word reaches Berlin in the way word does in wartime, through compartments. A colonel who knows a man in Madrid reports to a general who does not like his breakfast. A Luftwaffe analyst compares the dates in the letter with the pattern of Allied reconnaissance flights and finds comfort in the way they align. A whisper becomes a memo, becomes a briefing, becomes a finger drawing loops on a map around Greece and Sardinia, while the eyes in the room practice not glancing at Sicily. The briefcase has done its work without opening its mouth. Montague reads the second cable twice. Documents examined by Spanish authorities. German interest confirmed. He folds the paper slowly, sliding it into the inside pocket where good news and knives ride. He thinks of a coroner's scalpel pausing at the sternum and deciding there is no need to press. He thinks of a German who has held a letter up to the light and nodded to himself because he recognizes the shade of blue in the Admiralty's typewriter ribbon, something only an honest letter would have. He thinks, for the first time, that this might actually save the men it is meant to save. That night, he takes the long way home. He passes a cinema where a queue stands in that particular British posture that suggests obedience and impatience share a coat. He thinks of Pam, an imaginary woman whose smile has become, for him, a proof. He imagines the man who will one day ask her whether she knew she was part of a deception, and the woman who will say, with more truth than falsehood, that she did not. There are still a dozen ways it can go wrong. A German pathologist can decide to be heroic. A Spanish official can decide to be tidy. A clerk can talk in a cafe where walls have ears with excellent memories. The enemy can be suspicious in precisely the way that ruins artistry, not inquisitive, just awkward. But for now, the current has carried their man to the right shore, and the paper in his briefcase has spoken the right words. In the weeks to come, a general will stand over a map and slide a wooden block from one end of Greece to the other and feel the private relief of a man who has guessed correctly. A submarine commander will read of landings in Sicily and allow himself a short, very rude laugh. A mother will receive a letter that is not a ribbon. And somewhere in London, two men will sit at a table in a room that smells of burned dust and write their report in sentences that will be declassified long after they are dead. Before any of that, there is one more thing to do. The plan that turns a corpse into a compass requires a coda. The papers must pass through a specific set of hands. The consulate must press with exactly the right amount of propriety. The German appetite must not be so greedy that it chews the seed of doubt. The submarine's log must say less than it knows. The Spanish file must say more than it suspects. And the British must pretend to be embarrassed in precisely the tone that reassures the thief he has stolen something real. In the morning, Montague will draft a letter that suggests a mild panic in Whitehall's corridors. He will underline a phrase twice because panic needs emphasis to be believable. He will ask for the return of the documents with the precise urgency of a man who assumes they have been read. He will write, "We must insist they remain sealed," which is a gentleman's way of saying, "We know they will not." He will send it off, and then he and Cholmondeley will begin the patient work of waiting, the one intelligence skill no school teaches and every war requires. By dusk, news from Madrid will confirm that the briefcase has crossed the invisible border between curiosity and evidence. The neutral's duty has been performed. The bellies of two empires have been scratched. Somewhere on a German airfield, a pilot will run his hand along the cold skin of his machine and wonder idly whether the next orders will take him east or south. Somewhere on a Sicilian road, a boy will ride his bicycle past an empty checkpoint and think that the war, like the weather, has decided to be kind. Before the tide carried Major William Martin to the right shore and the wrong conclusions, London had to build him, bone by borrowed bone, paper by careful paper. Now that he has arrived, the next act belongs to the people who will believe him, and to the sea, which keeps its own counsel. Chapter 2 will open with the submarine's wake fading under a moon that didn't notice a thing, and with a Spanish fisherman tightening a knot that will pull Berlin's gaze away from Sicily long enough for real ships to find real sand. Dawn came to Huelva the color of old coins. The fishing boats creaked against their ropes, gulls following the scent of yesterday's catch. Juan Luque, a fisherman's son since before he was a man, leaned over the rail to free his tangled net and saw a shape that did not belong. It floated like an accusation, boots down, head to the side, the tide cradling it with the patience only the sea affords the dead. The British uniform gleamed faintly under the film of salt and oil. A briefcase, chained to the wrist, swung with each small wave as if refusing to let go. By noon, the harbour police had hauled the body ashore. The town doctor, unused to intrigue but familiar with the dead, examined the man with clinical boredom. No wounds, no bullet holes, the lungs heavy with brine. A plane crash, perhaps. Papers in English, official-looking, sealed. He sent word to the Spanish authorities, and by nightfall a coded cable hummed toward Madrid. The Germans would know before breakfast. What followed, though, had been written months earlier in London, in ink that had barely dried. In a basement that smelled of polish and damp paper, Ewan Montague stood over a table where identity lay in pieces. He had before him what most people leave behind without thinking: keys, cigarettes, bills, theatre stubs, a letter folded too often, and a photograph with a crease through the smile. Beside him, Charles Cholmondeley adjusted his spectacles, his excitement poorly disguised as fatigue. "This," Cholmondeley said, holding up the photo, "is the soul of our man." "She looks like someone who believes in train punctuality," Montague replied dryly. "Perfect." Pam was her name, at least on paper. The letter she'd written was short, affectionate, and frivolous. "Darling Bill, I can't believe you forgot the tickets again. You're hopeless. Love, Pam." A love note written by a secretary in room 13 who didn't ask questions. The body, their Major William Martin, rested downstairs, embalmed by secrecy as much as science. Glinda Michael, a name no document would carry again, had been transformed into a man with a future stolen to protect 1,000 others. His death was now a tool. His silence, a weapon. Montague checked the papers once more. The forged letter from Lieutenant General Nye to General Alexander was almost perfect. Informal tone, scattered abbreviations, the scent of real bureaucracy. A small coffee ring on the corner gave it the final touch of authenticity. "No one fakes mess," Montague said. "Mess is the hallmark of truth." Cholmondeley nodded. "Then let's hope the Germans love clutter." April 30th, 1943. HMS Seraph, somewhere off the coast of Spain. Midnight, and the sea was mercifully calm. The men moved in silence. In the forward compartment the wrapped body waited with chains, dressed in uniform, the briefcase locked and secured. Lieutenant Jewell, the commanding officer, glanced at Montague's sealed orders once more. "Drop point confirmed?" "Here," the navigator whispered. "Current will take him toward Huelva." They surfaced under a moon smudged by cloud. The air smelled of iron and diesel. 2 sailors lifted the stretcher, their breath frosting in the dark. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the captain murmured, "Commit the package." The canvas slid into the water with a gentle splash. For a second it floated, unwilling to sink, then turned and began its quiet drift toward destiny. A sailor crossed himself. "God forgive us," he said. Another muttered, "He'll forgive us if it works." As the submarine slipped back under, the wake spread outward, carrying not just a body, but a story carefully built to deceive an empire. 2 days later, the British consul in Huelva received a telephone call that made his coffee go cold. "A body, Senor Haselden." British officer, apparently. The Spanish police have him. Hazelden knew what this meant. The plan, Operation Mincemeat, had reached its test. His orders were to play his role exactly, anxious enough to seem real, careless enough to seem credible. He wrote a formal note to the Spanish authorities expressing concern about the loss of important personal effects belonging to the deceased Major Martin. The letter's tone was crafted to tempt curiosity, not close it. In Madrid, the German attaché, Colonel Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, received his own report, through channels far less official. The body's papers, whispered one source, referenced operations in Greece and Sardinia. Kuhlenthal sent a summary to Berlin within hours. Within 2 days, the originals, photographed, copied, and carefully resealed, were on a plane to Hitler's desk. In London, Montague and Cholmondeley waited. Each passing day without a reply felt like holding one's breath underwater. The mission was out of their hands now, living or dying inside the minds of men who thought themselves too clever to be fooled. The danger came not from Berlin, but from Huelva itself. The Spanish coroner, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez, was too competent for comfort. He noted the lungs filled with water, the liver oddly soft. "Plane crash, yes," he told his assistant, "but the stomach, why so little salt?" A pause. No, write it as drowning. The British will not want a fuss in London." When the report arrived through diplomatic back channels, Montague exhaled. "We've escaped the scalpel," he said, "by the grace of bureaucratic laziness." The body was buried with military honors, Spanish soldiers saluting under a flag they didn't understand. A local priest whispered blessings for a soul who'd never lived. Major William Martin now had a grave, and his story, finally, had wings. A week later, German High Command reviewed the decoded material. The letters looked real, too real to doubt. Greece and Sardinia, they concluded, were the true Allied targets. Sicily was mentioned only as a diversion. Hitler's margin notes were simple and chilling. Confirm. Reinforce Greece. Expect feint elsewhere. Panzer divisions began to move south. Luftwaffe squadrons redeployed to the Aegean. Field Marshal Rommel was ordered to inspect Greek defences personally. The deception had taken hold, swallowing logic and caution alike. When the first confirmation telegram reached London, Montagu sat very still. The words were plain. Material believed genuine. German forces repositioning accordingly. He allowed himself one small victory, a nod, nothing more. Across the table, Cholmondeley grinned like a man who'd survived a coin toss with fate. In the weeks that followed, the two men lived between dread and disbelief. They couldn't speak of what they'd done, not even to family. They went to work each morning as if nothing had happened, while elsewhere entire divisions moved on their signal. The corpse they'd launched into the sea was now steering the war itself. "Do you ever think about him?" Cholmondeley asked one night, long after curfew, as they walked back through blackout streets. "Every day," Montagu said, "and I imagine he'd forgive us if he knew what his death brought." The other man nodded. "Then let's hope the sea keeps its secrets." By July 1943, the bait had done its work. Hitler's armies waited in Greece for an invasion that never came. When the Allies landed on Sicily, German reinforcements were hundreds of miles away, guarding empty beaches. The island fell in 6 weeks. But that part of the story belongs to another chapter. For now, in that quiet summer of lies, the Germans were congratulating themselves on their foresight. The briefcase at the center of it all rested beneath layers of sealed reports, a curiosity filed away and forgotten. And beneath the white stones of a cemetery in Huelva, Major William Martin, who never lived, was winning a war he would never see. By the time dawn broke over Sicily on July 9, 1943, the lie had already done its work. The beaches were quiet, too quiet for what the Germans had promised themselves would be a slaughter. Allied ships crept through the grey mist like phantoms. Guns were primed, nerves taut. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, entire panzer divisions waited in Greece for an invasion that would never come. The real attack had begun in silence, and the silence was the sound of victory. In Berlin, the situation maps still glowed with red arrows pointing toward the Balkans. Reports from Luftwaffe scouts confirmed what they thought they knew. Heavy Allied radio traffic near Greece. False trails laid by the very men who'd written them. Hitler was convinced he'd been right all along, that Sicily was a feint. "They are trying to deceive us," he said. And he was right, though not in the way he imagined. By the second day of the invasion, the German command finally realized something was wrong. The Italian garrisons were collapsing, and the so-called diversion in Sicily had become the main event. But by then, it was too late. Their best units were trapped in the wrong theatre, chasing ghosts conjured by a corpse and a briefcase. In London, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted frantic German communications. "Reinforcements diverted south," one message read. Another, "Führer orders continue as planned, Greek front priority." Montagu read those lines in a small, crowded room and felt something close to disbelief. "He still thinks Greece?" someone muttered. Montagu only nodded. Then, "Our man has done his job." The victory in Sicily wasn't bloodless, no victory ever is, but it was faster, cleaner, and far less costly than anyone had predicted. Thousands of lives were saved because an enemy had believed in a story too neatly told. Every soldier who stepped ashore under lighter fire, every pilot who lived to see another dawn, owed his survival to a lie built in a London basement and buried in Spanish sand. Yet triumph, when it came, was quiet. There were no parades, no medals. The men who had conceived the plan were forbidden to speak of it. To the world, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, remained what he had always been, a tragic casualty of war. Only a handful of people knew that his body had turned the tide of a continent. Ewan Montagu sat alone one night, weeks after the landings, staring at the letter from Pam, the same letter he'd written in her hand. "Darling Bill, you're hopeless." He read the words aloud softly, almost reverently. The paper was smudged now, the ink fading. "Hopeless," he repeated, and smiled a tired smile. He thought of Glinda Michael, the man who'd never lived enough to know what he'd done. A forgotten Welsh drifter who in death had outwitted an empire. Cholmondeley joined him in the dim light of their office. "Berlin's still shifting divisions," he said, dropping a cable onto the table. "They're expecting a Balkan landing any day now." Montagu looked up, weary but certain. Then, "The body still speaks." The two men sat in silence, listening to the hum of distant typewriters and the low whistle of the wind outside. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Cholmondeley said, almost gently, "Do you ever feel we borrowed too much from death?" Montagu leaned back, fingers steepled. "Maybe," he said, "but I'd borrow from the grave again if it meant fewer graves to fill." Weeks later, the final report crossed Churchill's desk. Operation Mincemeat, successful beyond expectation. The Prime Minister scrawled a single note in the margin, "A brilliant piece of work," and underlined it twice. That was all the recognition they would ever receive. The war went on. France would come next, then the long push toward Germany. But the foundations of those future victories were laid, in part, by a man who never lived. Every deception after fake armies, phantom radio chatter, dummy tanks lined up along the English coast was a descendant of the same audacious idea born from a detective novel and a dead man. Years later, when the story was finally declassified, journalists called it the most successful deception in military history. Montagu would publish his memoir, The Man Who Never Was, and the public would marvel at the ingenuity, the risk, the near misses. But what the files could not capture were the silences, the moments between decisions when morality and necessity blurred like ink in rain. In 1954, a small bronze plaque was placed above a modest grave in Huelva. The inscription read, "William Martin, Royal Marines, served his king and country, 1907 to 1943. Greater love hath no man than this." Beneath that stone lay not a major nor a hero, but a man whose death had been rewritten for history. Sometimes Montagu would imagine Glyndwr Michael's spirit wandering the coast, watching the fishermen haul in their nets, unseen but smiling. Perhaps he'd forgive them for the bargain they made in his name. Perhaps he'd understand that in a world gone mad, even decency needed to wear a disguise. Operation Mincemeat didn't just fool Hitler. It reshaped the art of war. It proved that victory didn't always roar. It whispered, plotted, and floated ashore disguised as tragedy. The greatest weapon, Montagu would later say, was not a gun or a bomb, but the story your enemy most wants to believe. And so, history moved on. The maps changed, the borders shifted, the graves multiplied. but in a quiet Spanish cemetery, the sea still murmurs against the stones, and the wind still carries a secret that once deceived an empire. For months, Hitler's generals fought shadows, phantom invasions, imaginary armies, threats that existed only in ink and saltwater, and through it all, one name endured, carved into a borrowed tomb: Major William Martin, Royal Marines, the man who never was. Like, comment, and share this story of deception, courage, and the quiet brilliance that changed the course of history. And remember, sometimes the smallest lie, told at the right moment, can save the world.